Ayaan Hirsi Ali has become a polarizing figure on the international stage. On one side, she has championed the rights of Muslim women and Western values. On the other, she has been vilified by critics for her criticisms of Islam. She takes her critiques of Islam further with her new book called Heretic: Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali joins us now in the studio. It's a great pleasure to meet you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. You have been making this case for quite some time, and I've seen you obviously on many other programs, so it's a delight to finally meet you. Let's set the foundation for our conversation by just putting some of these numbers up. Sheldon, if you would. Here in the year 2010 is the latest numbers available. Muslims numbering 1.6 billion people worldwide. That's 23% of the world's population. If growth trends continue as they have, by the year 2050, the estimate is that Muslims will number 2.76 billion people worldwide. That's nearly 30%. Christians, just by way of comparison, now number a little over 31% of the global population, and the estimate is that that will hold steady. You start your book, Ayaan, with the following. My argument is that it is foolish to insist, as our leaders habitually do, that the violent acts of radical Islamists can be divorced from the religious ideals that inspire them. Instead, we must acknowledge that they are driven by a political ideology, an ideology embedded in Islam itself, in the holy book of the Quran, as well as the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad contained in the Hadith. Let me make my point in the simplest possible terms. Islam is not a religion of peace. Okay. You are off to a provocative start, if I may say. Of course, since 9/11, people in all sorts of positions of responsibility, be it the President of the United States to the local imam, have said Islam, when not perverted, is a peaceful religion. Why do you disagree with that?
Because I think Islam is not reformed. Islam did not go through a process of reformation. Islam did not go through a process of enlightenment. And so the Islam we have now is the unreformed Islam. And I think it's better for Muslims first and foremost, and for the rest of the world, to not provoke, but I urge that we start this process of reformation, which I think in many ways is actually underway.
More on that in a bit, this notion that it's underway. But just so I'm clear, you're not merely saying that it is the Islamists who have perverted the religion, and we know about that. You're saying Islam at its core is still a religion of violence?
Islam at its core contains elements of violence that we see play itself out on the global arena. There is an Islam as it is, and there is an Islam as we wish it to be. So we are not there. We don't have that Islam of peace, but that Islam of peace can come about through this process of critical thinking. And I think that, and I don't want to go too fast for you, but instead of talking about many different Islams or the hijacking of Islam, I think the best thing to do is to acknowledge the diversity among Muslims. Come from different countries, different gender, color, social income, you name it. There's that great diversity of Muslims. And I think that it is more useful to distinguish between those Muslims, the ones who want, I call them the Medina Muslims.
Hold off on that, because we are going to get to that. We got a lot of time to talk here, and we're going to have this all unfold as we go along here. But again, just so I'm clear, I've heard so many people say Islam is at war with the West. A, do you believe that? And B, or is it more like Islam is at war with itself? Which is more accurate to say?
There is a set of Muslims who use Islam to go to war with other Muslims and to go to war with the West and other civilizations.
So Islam is at war with the West, or more likely itself?
Islam is at war with itself, and Islam has declared war on the West. And Islam has also declared war on all non-Muslims. It's not only the West, it's beyond the West.
All right, let's go back to the Protestant Reformation, Europe, hundreds of years ago. You talk about it in the book. What did you learn from examining that process?
Well, I've learned a lot. I've also learned that there is no agreement on what the Reformation was about and that whole process. But the most, I found three very important parallels with what I think, and that's why I think that Islamic Reformation is underway or a Muslim Reformation is underway. First, what the printing press was to the Christian Reformation, the internet today and literacy. Literacy and the internet can be for the process of a Muslim Reformation. What these kings, some of them of course very despotic, were, and who were interested in changing the church because of their own self-interest and their own self-preservation, what we are seeing now are some despots in the Middle East and other countries that feel threatened by outfits like the Islamic State and are actually interested in change. I quote the new president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, when he goes to Al-Azhar University and demands a revolution in religion. And then finally, the urban elite, again, who felt that their interests were more protected by a reformed church. And the urban elite that we saw demonstrating during the Arab Spring, not only against the despots, but against Sharia law. So you have a combination of these three parallels already under play, and among many other factors, and that makes me so hopeful that this process of Reformation is underway.
Would you compare the Arab Spring to the Protestant Reformation?
I wouldn't compare it directly. There are many differences, many similarities. The context, everything is different. But what I find interesting about some of those people who were out there and were protesting was that not only their rejection of Sharia law, but their determination to ask very difficult questions within the religion. And that's brand new.
Let me read an excerpt now. This is from a guy named Gerard Russell, Senior Fellow with the New America Foundation. As quoted in the New York Review of Books recently, he writes, "It has become common in Western circles, infused by the Whig interpretation of history, to speak of the need for a Muslim Luther to introduce liberalism in Islam. The troubles of the Muslim world, however, are not those of pre-Reformation Europe, but rather of the Reformation in full swing. Hundreds of splintering congregations are seeking to suppress the accretions of popular religion and return to the letter of the original scriptures, denouncing and warring with one another and the resurgent hierocrats of Shia Islam in Iran. Nobody speaks for all Muslims, and political power is sought on the back of religious piety. If one is to engage in the prescribing of solutions for Islam, a presumptuous excursion into the realm of the hypothetical, and to be done with due humility, then the fall of the Ottomans inspires a different thought. Perhaps we should encourage our Muslim friends to seek not a Luther, but a Pope." Do you think it's desirable to find a Pope who can speak for all Muslims?
I think, first of all, it's very important that we clarify what we mean by a reformation. I think in the Christian sense, it meant obviously, and that was Luther's mission, that you forget about the church and you as a believer go straight to the New Testament and live by that testament as literally as possible. And if you take that definition of a reformation, then what you see is what the people we've now come to call radical extremists, whether they're violent or non-violent, it doesn't matter, are actually seeking to try and live by the letter of the Quran, literally. So that's not the definition of a reformation in this book. Mm-hmm. In this book, the definition of a reformation is change. It is to reform, to identify what is wrong and then reform it, change it, modify it, renovate the House of Islam. That's my...
Would part of the renovation of the House of Islam involve creating, for lack of a better expression, a Pope?
See, that is what I think is much more unrealistic, because now Islam covers not only 1/5 of humanity, but they live in different nation states, different groups, different sects, you name it, and I think that is much more unrealistic. I think with the internet, with literacy, it's better to invest in a process that is bottom-up, that's grassroots, where individuals learn to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong, even if their God and their prophet tells them to do what is wrong.
Well, you say it's unrealistic, but I know a guy who's running for the job. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of IS.
Yeah.
He's basically putting himself up there as the guy who's going to unite Islam around the world. What don't we understand about Islamic State that you think we need to understand in order to better appreciate what's happening right now in the world?
I think those of us who pay attention, the Quran is not a very big book. If you take the volumes of a hadith, that's also not too much. You could read it in a month. And what we don't want to see, but what is there before our eyes, is that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and his outfit are trying to live, he's trying to emulate the Prophet Muhammad, especially in his period in Medina. And everything he prefaces, and the other ISIS leaders, when their publications, they justify all of their actions by first prefacing it by saying, and the Prophet, peace be upon him, and in the Quran, this verse, that verse. And I think that is, that is a reality that it's so grim and it's so awful, and I wish I could spare it all Muslims, but it's something we can't ignore.
You say grim and awful, but there are thousands of Western nationals who are leaving their comfortable middle-class existences to move overseas and take up arms. What does he know that apparently the rest of us don't know about the attractiveness of what he's offering?
What he knows is that if you are raised a Muslim, you are taught to believe that the Quran is the true word of God and that you should obey every word in it, even if you've never read it, and that the Prophet Muhammad is the perfect moral human being and was and should be emulated. He understands that. He also understands that if you're raised in a Muslim home, there's a lot of talk of life after death, and he invests in that. He uses these three very general aspects of Islam to draw in young, impressionable minds who are seeking a purpose, who are driven by conviction, and who want to do something moral and something big that transcends themselves. And he appeals to them by saying simply, if you are a true Muslim, then this is what you should be doing. And he's managed, unfortunately, to convince thousands of people, some of them from very liberal, very peaceful, prosperous societies.
And some of them women. What's the appeal for women?
Many of them women. Again, I completely describe in the book how my own process of radicalization and then leaving it. What is in it for women? You're going to live as a pious Muslimah. You are going to serve the caliphate in the hope that, again, there's that emphasis on life after death. When this temporary life is behind you and you die, hopefully as a martyr, you're going to go to paradise. A simple narrative.
It's a simple narrative, but an appeal to some religious doctrine, obviously deep inside, even the most seemingly thoroughly westernized Muslims. So do you think is the root of that more in socioeconomic factors, or is it more in religious factors?
I say it's more in religious factors because, again, there's this diversity within the followers of the Islamic State today in socioeconomic status. Some of them are extremely wealthy. Think about all those guys who give tons of money to the Islamic State. Some of them are highly educated. Some of them are poor, some of them are female, some of them are young, some of them are old. And given that diversity, I think it would be, again, sticking your head in the sand to pretend that it's only socioeconomic. Because these are poor people and very angry people and full of resentment, they go to the Islamic State. That's too simplistic. We've been saying that since 9/11, and the problem has only been getting bigger, and we are surprised more and more often, again, by young people, highly educated, from the United States of America, from Canada, from the UK, volunteering for this.
Okay, Ayaan, let's take a step back here and return to what you were talking about several minutes ago when you wanted to talk about the three types of Muslims that you refer to in this book. And let's go through this. The Medina Muslims, who are they?
The Medina Muslims are those who are convinced that Sharia law is the best recipe for society. And some of them have only local ambitions. Some of them have regional ambitions. Some of them, like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of the Islamic State, has global ambitions. Again, some of them want to get to that objective through preaching or da'wah, and they postpone the use of violence until they're in control. And some of them want to get through that process through jihad and a lifestyle of jihad or holy war and get there instantly. But regardless of whether you seek a peaceful end to that, or peaceful means, or violent means, the objection of the Medina Muslim is to live under Sharia law and to bring everyone else under Sharia law.
And their numbers are increasing, would you agree?
Their numbers are increasing. And not only are their numbers, they are a minority. I quote Ed Hussein here, who says it's only 3%, and then you just do the calculation, 3% of, what did we say, 1.6 or nearly 1.6 billion people. That takes us to 48 million people, and that's a huge number. And that the Medina Muslims are now strong enough to destabilize Muslim societies, and along with that, perhaps the rest of the world.
Do you know why their interpretation and following of the Quran is so literal?
Well, I mean, where do ideas of totalitarianism, literalist ideas, this longing for a utopia, it's very romantic. Where does it come from? It's human. It's not necessarily Muslim alone. We've seen other, secular promises of utopia. What is special about them is that they're using or trying to rekindle or revive a past that we are told was extremely glorious and perfect. And in many ways, if you compare, say, communism and National Socialism as totalitarian philosophies, they were interested in the future. These guys, they want to do something that has already happened or that they feel has happened.
As in recreating the caliphate?
Recreating the caliphate, that glorious past, and going and conquering the world and having the banner of Islam hang over the rest of the world, and then the Mahdi will come, the day of judgment, and they're the good guys. It's almost like a very simple Hollywood movie.
All right, those are the Medina Muslims. Let's do
Muslims.
the second kind, the Mecca Muslims. How would you describe them?
I would describe the Mecca Muslims as those who are caught between the siren song of the Medina Muslims, and by the way, their violence, not only the persuasion, and modernity. They confess to believe in the Prophet Muhammad and his example and the Quran, but they don't act that way. And they don't examine the text. They enjoy as many amenities of modernity as they can afford. And they are disgusted and deeply embarrassed by what is done by the Medina Muslims in the name of their religion. But they're too terrified to go to that mental place where instead of only condemning Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, you start to condemn part of the conduct of the Prophet Muhammad. That's just where they will not go. And so they're caught in that cognitive dissonance. And that cognitive dissonance is getting, it's heightened all the time because of the Islamic State, because of Al-Qaeda, because of all these terrorist attacks. People shouting Allahu Akbar, using the Shahada to kill others. And by the way, the Mecca Muslims are also the largest number of victims of the Medina Muslims.
So is there a sense of powerlessness that they feel right now because they're not sure if they're in this camp or that camp?
Powerlessness, frustration. Why can't they just leave us alone? And they're also frustrated by, non-Muslims asking questions continuously and saying, if you are really a peaceful Muslim, you should do something about this. And they throw their hands in the air and say, but what have I got to do with it?
And how many, if we talked about a few percentage of the Medina Muslims in the world, what percentage would you say are Mecca Muslims?
I would just say the absolute majority. They are the largest number of, and these are large numbers of people. It's people who really go about, or would like to just go about their daily lives, feed their kids, send them to school, and not harm anyone. I mean, some of them, I wouldn't agree with them on their treatment of women. I wouldn't agree with their homophobia. I wouldn't agree with a lot of, how they practice their religion and how they justify various forms of intolerance. But in general, I don't think they are the ones causing a world war.
Okay, type 3, the modifying Muslims. Who are they?
These are brave individuals, and they're, again, very diverse, who have stopped blaming outsiders and outside factors and are saying, yes, we need to review what we believe in. We need to review the position of the Prophet Muhammad and his example. We need to review the Quran. And we need to choose, they're saying, when it comes to the difference between man-made laws and God-made laws, we need to choose man-made laws to solve our problems, and we need to limit religion to only the spiritual realm. And I think that is, again, when I say change is underway, I just watch how that group is getting bigger and bigger, and I think that's where the reform is going to come from, the heretics.
Oh, you're heretics, as the title of your book suggests.
Yeah.
You're in this camp, obviously. Irshad Manji, a friend of this program.
I list her, yeah.
She's in here, and yes, she's listed in the back of the book, right. She's in this camp. How big, you say it's growing, but at the moment, still a fairly small percentage of the Islamic population?
I think it's a fairly small percentage, but also I don't think they're all visible because it's very dangerous in many places to come out as a heretic. I want to point out to the news I got today of the blogger, the Bangladeshi blogger, third in 3 months, who is hacked to death because he was blogging about secularism and reason. The other blogger, Saudi blogger, who is put in prison because he was also blogging about secularism and he was blogging for human rights. So to make that list of reformers, you also have to you have to face odds that the other groups don't face. And I think that because it's very difficult for them to be seen or heard, we are underestimating how large they are. They could be larger than I think.
It is a compelling argument to shut up, though, isn't it? Knowing
Especially,
that the security risks are
yeah,
profound.
especially if you're being hacked and threatened with that. I mean, you can just about imagine what these three incidents mean for the secular movement in Bangladesh. Highly educated, highly motivated, driven by reason, and objecting from the inside to the Islamic State and to jihadism and radicalism as we know it. And then something like this happens, the government doesn't protect them. And I mean, how many more bloggers are going to risk their lives knowing the consequences?
Let's take those three groups then that you just talked about, the Medina, the Mecca, and the modifying Muslims, and talk about how the events of the last, I guess, decade and a half have affected them. The influence of 9/11, Charlie Hebdo, the massacre there, Boko Haram, Malala Yousafzai, the young schoolgirl who was attacked with acid and
she was shot in the head.
shot in the face, yes, exactly.
By a grown-up man.
Let's talk about how those events affect these three different groups. Let's start with the Medina Muslims. What's their relationship with those events like?
Well, first of all, they're responsible for most of these horrors that we are seeing. The enslavement of women, the crimes against humanity, the killing and massacre of Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities, the blowing up of temples and artwork and national heritages. They're responsible for the violence. They cause mayhem and take advantage of the chaos that ensues because they thrive in chaotic situations where they can recruit more people and intimidate more people into joining them. What else do they do? Because they provoke the response of the world, they then use that as a propaganda method to say, look, Islam is under attack. They've listed the enemies of Islam to include almost everyone in the world except themselves, including Muslims. They are totalitarian, purely evil. Purely evil. And some of them think that they can get away with being pious and good by saying we don't employ violence. But if day in, day out they preach in schools and in Islamic seminaries and in Muslim centers that Sharia is the only moral way to live and Muhammad should be emulated in many ways, then you get those young men who start hacking bloggers and who, go from being non-violent to violent. So for me, the Medina Muslims are at the core of the problem.
How about the Mecca Muslims and those events and the influence on them?
The influence on the Mecca Muslims, unfortunately, is that some of their children are enticed by the Medina Muslims into joining them. We've just talked about the appeal. The Mecca Muslims, again, powerlessness, frustration. They're the victims of the Mecca Muslims. They see their villages and their homes, turned upside down, burned, become scenes of war. They're the displaced peoples, millions of displaced peoples now within the Middle East who've left their homes and who don't know where else to go. They're the people you see coming full of boats, trying to run away from all the from despotism in the name of, tribe or clan, secular despotism, and from the Islamic State. So the Mecca Muslims, I would say, are not only frustrated and powerless, but also incredibly challenged in their rights to life.
And the modifying Muslims, such as yourself, these events?
These events, so modifying Muslims, we are saying, and again, I just really want to emphasize, we're as diverse as can be. Our politics is as diverse as can be. We don't agree on global issues, but the core argument is we should stop pointing fingers at external factors and do something within our own religion. Try and change our own religion, change our politics, change our clan, and again, I can't help but be with them.
Let's move on to talk about the Reformation of Islam that you are prescribing in this book and the 5 things that you think are necessary. And we're going to go through each one of them one at a time, and then I'll get you to comment on them. Number one, the Quran as the last and immutable word of God and Muhammad's semi-divine and infallible status. What do you mean by that? What would you like to see happen to that?
What I mean by that is there is the holy book, the Quran, and it has ceased to be a book because of the Medina Muslims, has ceased to be an ancient text that we should read, if we read at all, in context. It's now become almost like a driver's manual for these Medina Muslims that say we should do what the verses command us to do. And many of the verses in the Quran are problematic, and that's an understatement. You know, the urges to kill, the commands to subjugate women, dividing the world into those who believe and those who don't, religious intolerance. And then there is the figure, the Prophet Muhammad, who is, again, is considered to be the perfect human being and the perfect moral model for all human beings at all times. Again, the problem with it, this man is not seen in his context in the 7th century. He is brought into the 21st century as a hero and as a model. And what would I like to see happen is to take the book and the man, see them in their context, and for the Mecca Muslims especially to come out and review the morality, Muhammad's conduct in Medina, the Quran in Medina, and reject that. In other words, not teach their children, because that way, if you teach children, okay, the Quran is the true word of God, you should emulate the Prophet Muhammad, you're taking these problems into the next generation and the next generation and the next generation. So reform will come with when these two, and I know that it's the most difficult of all points, but it is a point that has to be, we have to get there.
Do you make a distinction between Muslims need to be able to discuss the Prophet, they need to be able to ask questions about the Prophet? Do you make a distinction between that and, say, what Charlie Hebdo did, which was we need to be able to make fun of the Prophet and disrespect the Prophet?
Well, I support Charlie Hebdo, and I think that the Prophet is relevant for satire because the Prophet, again, is brought into the 21st century. So when people who teach us and critique society, they have to deal with issues like this. But the main thing is that you have to ask, you have to review the conduct of the Prophet Muhammad, especially in Medina. If he beheaded people, and if he took women as slaves, and if he killed homosexuals and stoned people for adultery, are these things that we should do now? Is he the perfect human moral model?
So put him in the context of his time.
Put him in the context of his time, and you can still respect him in his period in Mecca when he was only preaching, you know, be good to the poor, fast in the month of Ramadan and pray. We have no problems with that. But in that period in Medina, I think Muslims just have to start the conversation, and that's the purpose of this book, is to start the conversation about reviewing the conduct, the moral conduct of the Prophet Muhammad. You can't run away from that.
Plank number 2, Islam's emphasis on the afterlife instead of the here and now. There is a great focus, of course, in Islam that it is an honor to strap, among some, to strap a bomb to yourself and give your life in jihad. Why is that? Before, I understand why you want to change that. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is such a central part of Islam for too many people today?
Well, first of all, it's just how, if you grow up, again, in a Muslim home, you learn the prophets, the Quran, and that's, you know, life after death. You believe in life after death, and so in many ways you learn this life is temporary and we're all going to die, then all kinds of things are going to happen after you die. If you're a good person, you will be rewarded with heaven. If you're a bad person, you will be rewarded with hell, and that is then clearly defined. And what's happening, and again, all religions have an idea of the afterlife, but what's happening now with Islam is the Medina Muslims have developed this narrative of death. And this narrative of death is not that you kill yourself or take your life, but it is that you take your life while you kill others. And that makes you into a martyr, and then you get the greatest of rewards. And that narrative of death has to be addressed, and can only be addressed if we say, no, we want a narrative of life. We want to put more emphasis on life before death than instead of life after death.
Did I read correctly in here Saddam Hussein used to offer $25,000 to kids who killed themselves on behalf of Iraq?
Yeah, so some of the Palestinian, it was not on behalf of Iraq, but it was the Palestinians. If you killed to free Jerusalem from Israel, then you know, he would reward you, and he isn't the only one. And imagine he was secular.
So there is a great need you see today to have Muslims embracing a culture of life as opposed to a culture of death. Can I put it that way?
Absolutely. Mothers should love their sons and their sons' lives more than that they love death for their sons.
That's Golda Meir's line, the former Israeli prime minister.
Yeah, Golda Meir said they should love their children more than they hate us. Yeah, that was her line.
They need to love their children more than they hate our children. It was something like that.
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, I have, several testimonies there of women who are sending their children, their sons, to death, and then when the son dies, they ululate and they celebrate. And it's that narrative of death that has spread from out of Palestine into the rest of the Muslim world, and it's extremely dangerous and extremely dark.
Plank number 3 of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's Reformation of Islam. Sharia's place in the system of law governing the spiritual and temporal realms. Let's take a step back here for a second. Tell us what Sharia is and why it is so all-encompassing.
It is the law as set by Muhammad and later on developed by more and more scholars of Islam. And it governs morality, tells you the difference between right and wrong. It governs the family or social setting, the relationship between men and women, marriage, inheritance, you name it. It governs the economy of a society. It also governs military means. It's total. It's ancient. It's from times long gone by. And yes, a lot of Muslim scholars argue, but things have evolved and we've improved on, many things such as amputations and beheadings and the like. But in reality, the Medina Muslims and some of the Medina Muslims do not accept those improvements. They simply want to go back to the Quran and the Hadith. We've seen, even when you accept those improvements, societies governed by Sharia, such as Saudi Arabia, very dark, crimes against humanity, beheadings, amputations, and the status of women. I don't have to tell you. Saudi Arabia does not tolerate any other religion except Islam, and in fact only their understanding of Islam. Iran is developing a bomb and Iran's neighbors are worried and terrified that if Iran gets that nuclear bomb, things will really get out of hand in a very bad way. Again, that's Sharia. Sharia is violent. Sharia is bad for women. Sharia is homophobic. Sharia divides the world into believers and unbelievers. Sharia should be rejected completely.
So it needs to be done away with.
It should be done away with. If you respect human rights, if you respect an individual's life, male or female, individual's right to life and individual freedoms, you cannot be for Sharia.
There's plenty of stuff in the Old Testament that does not live up to 21st century multicultural Canadian standards.
But where is that applied?
Well, I guess that's the thing. Some of it is applied and some of it is not. So,
and where are the movements, global movements that want to bring back the Old Testament into life?
If you look at Orthodox Judaism, there's still plenty of people who practice that and say women don't count when you want to have a group of people who pray together. They
believe it, and some of them practice aspects of that, but the country of Israel is a free democratic country, the only one in the Middle East. I think that the more we get into that, and the more we start talking about what Christians are doing wrong and what Jews are doing wrong and what's in the Old Testament, New Testament, we move away from this discussion that we need to have so urgently, which is we need a Muslim Reformation now.
Point taken, back on track.
Yeah.
Point number 4, the obligation on ordinary Muslims to command right and forbid wrong. Explain that.
Not as well known in the West as within a Muslim household. The best way to explain it is, so when I was a believing Muslim and lived within the context of my family, my sister would say, when it was prayer time, Ayaan, get up, go and pray. Sounds innocent enough, right? Taken to an extreme, recently we had a woman in Afghanistan accused of burning the Quran. And the man shouts, look, she burned the Quran. And a mob of men run toward her and starts lynching her, basically.
And she didn't do it.
And she didn't do it. But that is commanding right. It's, you don't go to the government or you don't call the police, you don't tell an authority, this person did something wrong, but it's the obligation to disapprove of misconduct when you see it, and then to do it verbally, and at times to use violence if you can.
And that needs to end as well.
That needs to end, because we don't, and here's where toleration, that should be replaced with a message of tolerance and toleration, because human beings don't agree on what's moral and immoral.
The 5th of your 5 points, the concept of jihad or holy war, you need to see this end as well.
It is, I mean, the Islamic State is proving my point on a daily basis. A holy war. And we've now seen really massacres, crimes against humanity. We've seen them kill Yazidis, take their women and sell them into slavery, kill Christians. Where are the Christians of the Middle East? They've been driven out, killed, wiped out, their property taken, their women raped, all in the name of jihad, because they are not, they're infidels. And in fact, some of these radicals, Medina radicals, they go even further by declaring Muslims un-Islamic and then going after them. So this holy war should be replaced with a narrative of holy peace.
Holy peace.
Yeah.
You've made a couple of references to your own past when you were, as a younger child, growing up as a very religious person. And can we explore some of that a little bit? Because you have been on quite a journey.
Yeah.
Life started for you where?
I was born in Mogadishu, Somalia in 1969.
And you were born into a religious family, yes?
I was born into a religious family that in that period I would describe as Mecca Muslims. They were religious in the sense that they were pious, practiced, prayed, fasted, but they were not, there was a lot of politics. I was also born into a political family, but the politics of my family had nothing to do with religion. So they objected, for instance, to the dictatorship of Siad Barre, but that was done in a secular language. My father was fighting for a democracy back then, and it's later on, near his death, that he started talking about Sharia law. But back then it was secular, and that is a Mecca type of Muslim. So I believed.
You believed?
I believed, and in those days, when I didn't practice, it wasn't a big problem. You could be urged, go and pray, but if you didn't do it, we all forgot to pray.
Can you target something in particular that began your either questioning of or moving away from Islam?
Well, that is much later when I'm in the Netherlands. But first I moved from being a Mecca Muslim. In my teens, I joined the Medina Club, and it comes to us through the Muslim Brotherhood. There are individuals from within our community, teachers and preachers, who come and preach to us that we should be not passive, but become active observers, and then actively try to make, through commanding right and forbidding wrong, make the rest of the Muslim community more observant, and so in that sense expand the base of the Medina Muslims. And I was in the Netherlands 9/11, 2001, when for the first time I dared to answer some of the questions or not ignore some of the questions that I had in the past. And I tell in this book, but also more in detail in Infidel, the biggest, I would say, the most liberating feel was when I told myself, but there is no life after death. And so I didn't have to fear hell. I didn't have to fear punishment, and I didn't have to live my life in fear. Life was what was before death. That's at least what we have any evidence for. We have no evidence of life after death. And that, I think, it has made me more moral. It has made me more truthful to myself and to others. And I think we can't start the conversation on a reformation unless we put question marks on,
What happened when you told your family that revelation?
They were very, very, very upset. My father was very upset. My mother is she's still very upset. My brother, nobody understands it. It's for them, I became a traitor, an infidel. My mother said, "You've brought me a lot of grief."
They have not forgiven you yet.
They haven't forgiven me, and that sometimes it just shows how religious belief can be divisive instead of the people who, and I've never given up on them, and I love them very much. And
can you see them anymore?
No, my mother is in Somalia, and I can't go to Somalia. Yeah, and my brother is there too.
And they don't leave, and you can't see them on quote-unquote neutral territory?
No, and I also don't want to put them in trouble.
I presume there must have been, though, quite a culture shock when you became fully immersed in sort of Western society, given the background that you came from. How'd you deal with that?
I just kept on, I did two things. I decided every time I was put in again, what I call a cognitive dissonance. So I would be, when I was interacting with Muslims, and I would be reminded, you need to pray, you need to cover up, you need to behave like a Muslim. That would set off a chain of thoughts in my head where I feared hellfire and I wouldn't be able to live my life in comfort. And so I started avoiding anybody who would ask me such questions, and that's how I survived. And I couldn't survive when 9/11 came because it was all around us. That's again what I mean by this cognitive dissonance is heightened by events, by the Medina Muslims. Sometimes you simply can't avoid it. And then obviously I spent 5 years in the University of Leiden doing my master's in political science. And back then, I don't know if Leiden is still like that, I hope it is, but my professor's business was to teach us how to think and how to think critically, and I'm extremely grateful for that. And it is through that process of education that I have come to adopt the moral position that I hold today.
The murder of Theo van Gogh, what influence did that have on you?
I think it brought home and very close that this intent on killing for such things as apostasy or insulting the Prophet was real, and it was in Holland, and there were people in Holland who were willing to do it. So it wasn't only the murder of Theo van Gogh, but there were many others. And yeah, the threat wasn't just a threat now, it was for real. And of course, the mourning and sadness and grief that Theo is gone.
You knew him well.
I didn't know him very well. I knew him a little bit. But when the man I came to know was a funny man, an intelligent man, and he was very concerned with the spread of radical Islam before I was.
When you left the Netherlands and came to America, there was some interesting reaction. We're going to get into some of that right now. Here is Joshua Holland, who's a digital producer at BillMoyers.com. You know Joshua? You know of Joshua. Okay, here we go. Mr. Director, please. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a proud Somali woman raised in a devout Muslim family. She is poised to become the most recognizable face of naked Islamophobia in America. Expect to see her as a ubiquitous guest on cable news channels and frequent contributors of op-eds reinforcing the worst stereotypes about the Muslim world. She'll validate already disturbingly common narratives about the perfidy of Islam, and she'll tout the vast superiority of Western thinking in stark terms that would be shocking coming from a more traditional, read, white Christian right-wing commentator. Let's just get some initial reaction to you to that, and then we'll follow up.
That man is not interested in the well-being of Muslims. If he were, Muslims in America and Muslims outside of America, he would be urging and he would be helping me with this questioning. It is through questioning, critical thinking. That is the best way, I think, that a lot of Muslims, millions of Muslims who are grappling on the one hand with modernity, on the other hand with what is done in the name of their religion. It is through this process of questioning and through rallying around of these amendments that their lives will improve. They will not improve by people with white guilt who try to shut down that debate through this type of smears.
But it's interesting that there are some liberal Americans who are not with you, and you would think they should be with you.
Yeah.
What's their agenda, do you think?
I think some of it's Paul Berman wrote a very good book about that, and he comes to the conclusion there is actual fear. People are scared that if they ask why Islam as an ideology, unreformed, especially Islamism, the political ideology, the agenda of the Medina Muslims, that if they try and understand how that is an enemy of liberalism, that they will be attacked, so actual fear and fear of threats. But they also, some people, and you can explain this to me, white men find it's almost the most offensive thing ever to be called a racist. I would find it very offensive to be called a racist, but now it's used as a tool to shut debate down on Islam, which is a set of beliefs. Islam is not a race. Muslims are as diverse as can be. Why do they do that? I don't know. I've read all about white guilt. I've read about, this whole, people don't want to be Orientalist. Some of them are they are critical of America and American foreign policy, and they think that everyone else is the victim of American foreign policy. But these are all excuses. These are all excuses. This doesn't. It's not a proposal for, these people are not proposing ways of solving this massive world problem that we are in.
Okay, I hear you, but it may be that they feel that you are denigrating Islamic culture and suggesting that it is inferior to Western culture. Are you doing that?
I think the system of Sharia is inferior to Western culture. If you don't see that, then you and I can't have a conversation about that, because, again, my liberalism is a liberalism where, the liberalism I believe in is not something that just came about. There were hundreds of years that people fought for it, that happened to be in the West, but it's a universal principle that all human beings are created equal and they're free. And Sharia law is against that. And jihad is against that. And this excessive emphasis on life after death is against that. If you don't see that difference, then you can't tell the difference between right and wrong.
Can we talk about Brandeis
You can't even be a liberal.
Can we talk about Brandeis?
Please.
You were to receive an honorary degree from Brandeis University in Boston, and, well, they made the offer, and then what happened?
And then what Asra Nomani, a journalist and a friend in the United States of America, calls the honor brigade, has started, they started to put the president of Brandeis under pressure to withdraw. And unfortunately, he succumbed to that pressure.
How big did the protests get, or the pressure get?
In relative terms, it wasn't that big. I think it's something like 87 faculty members who signed out of 300 and something. And I mean, in defense of Brandeis, many professors in Brandeis and many students in Brandeis wrote to me and apologized and just showed that they were very disgusted with what happened. So it's not just, it wasn't just the 87, but yeah, I mean, symbolically, it tells you that, and Brandeis is only one. There's this whole debate on academic freedom in the United States of America right now. It's not only related to Islam, it's related to minorities and many other factors. But the Honor Brigade of Islam take advantage of that. They take advantage of this liberal weakness.
So if you know what it is, why do you think the president caved? The president of Brandeis, why did he cave in?
He wrote to me saying he had no idea that I had made statements in the past, and that's when you then start to think, really? I mean,
He didn't know who you were?
No, he knew, because he's the one who offered me, but he said he didn't know that I had said some of the things that I was being accused of saying. And I was like, there's Google right there.
Yes.
Yeah.
You do appear on television from time to time as well. I think people know what you feel.
And why I feel it, and why I think, of course, it's controversial, but I don't know. I just think that promoting a message of reformation is so much more effective and so much better for Muslims than all these people who want to protect them from. It's almost as if they don't trust Muslim individuals with the idea that they can think, or that they can think for themselves. And in there is a form of hidden racism, and the person who is, or bigotry of sorts, and the person who's guilty of this bigotry is even oblivious to it.
A bigotry of low expectations in some
Bigotry of
respects.
low expectations, and a bigotry of an expectation of violence. I remember a discussion of the New York Times and why they did not reprint the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. And I think their editor said, well, there's this woman who lives in Brooklyn who may wear the headscarf, is a pious Muslim, and she's a reader of the New York Times, and I don't want to offend her. And I just don't think he realized and thought through what that is saying about his attitude to Muslims and Muslim women.
I hear you, but it's not a crazy concern, though. I mean, you are in Toronto today. There are 2 security guys over here.
So was the editor-in-chief of the New York Times scared for his life? And if that is the case, then it's very clear that the First Amendment is no longer a right that we can take for granted. That makes the First Amendment in the United States and free speech in general in the West a privilege. Only if you can afford, and he can afford, security. And we are now at a time, I think, when it's much more effective if we fight for that freedom of speech than if we wait when we all can't afford it.
Let me follow up with this. Having read the book and now having listened to you, I know what you want. You seem to think it's actually happening, that the reformation of Islam is underway. I'm going to play the skeptic on this, okay? I'm going to be the guy who looks around the world and reads a lot of newspapers every day and is immersed in news and concludes, really? You really think it's underway? There is so much evidence to the contrary.
Yeah.
So convince me.
And that's understandable because there's so much evidence to the contrary. But if you look through that darkness of mayhem and, bloodshed and refugees and just human despair, you will see that there are more and more Muslims who are Muslim and identify themselves as Muslim and are even pious, but who reject Sharia law. They write about it, they blog about it, they demonstrate it. I want to again point to Tunisia, struggling to survive as a democracy, being challenged by the Medina Muslims, but hanging in there, and I think we need to support them. The crowds and crowds of secular Muslims in Egypt who rejected Mohammed Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood's agenda of Sharia. Yes, they've put themselves in the same place, you would say. They have another military dictator, but the alternative was chaos. And again, like I said, Medina Muslims thrive on chaos. So while there is some order, I think we again need to back those thousands, if not millions of Egyptians who rejected Sharia law when they could. The Iranians who live and have lived since 1979 with Sharia law, who are now out in the streets. There are estimates that probably 70% of young people under 30 in Iran may not even be believers at all. I see all of these developments, these bloggers who are coming out. People are taking, Muslims from within Islam are running extremely high risks to transform their own societies and draw them away from Sharia law. And that just gives me hope. And I think that's what the liberals miss, or the people who call themselves liberal. We need to be backing these people.
Okay, that's the message.
Yeah.
Let me ask you now about the messenger. Is this book number 4?
It's number 4. The first book was a bundle of essays and interviews.
Okay.
Whatever you call it.
Here's what The Economist had to say earlier this year. They say, if there is to be any chance that Muslims can be persuaded to set aside pre-modern ideas about law, war, and punishment, the persuader will not be a sophisticated secularist. It is more likely to be somebody who fervently believes in the divine origins of the Quran, but is able to look at it again and extract from its words a completely fresh set of conclusions. We get the message. Are you the wrong messenger?
Well, I hate to disagree with The Economist, but on this, of course, they are wrong and they're also pessimistic. And that's a very, in my view, it's a functional way of thinking about things, also given that Islam doesn't have a pope. I think that for change to come to Islam, a true reformation, and here is a fresh set of 5 theses that I think, 5 amendments that can be made, it is going to come from the heretics. It's not going to come from the clergymen. If you fervently believe in the divine origin of the Quran, then you can't argue with God and make these amendments. I think it's not going to be a sophisticated atheist like me, but it can be one of those people, or many of those people, whom I list in the appendix. And the key is to make that group the largest group, because then you stop the generational, like I said, the Mecca Muslims teach their children in these absolute truths, and that goes on to the next generation and the next generation. And the way to stop it is to expand that, those groups, those individuals that I call the reformers or the heretics. Change is going to come from the heretics. It's not going to come from the clergymen. It
took other religions hundreds and hundreds of years for it to happen. How long is it going to take Islam?
I hope much sooner than that and much faster than that. And anyway, when I say underway, also the question of what needs to change within Islam, should Islam change? Is it the religion? Is it the people? That's been underway now for a long time. And by the way, The Economist has covered that very, very well. Because they shouldn't go all pessimistic on us now.
Good.
Yeah.
It's a great pleasure to meet you. The name of the book is Heretic, Why Islam Needs a Reformation Now. Ayaan Hirsi Ali has been our guest. Great to meet you, and thanks for coming into TVO tonight.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.